long before there were kings, long before there were ships with dragon prows slicing through gray northern waves, long before there was even a name like Denmark, there was only ice, not the soft, fleeting frost that dusts a Copenhagen windowsill in December, but a titanic weight of frozen time, a glacier, miles thick, that pressed down on this land with the patience of eternity. For tens of thousands of years, what we now call Denmark did not exist as soil, forest, or coastline. It was buried, smothered beneath the Fennoscandian ice sheet, a vast river of ice that swept down from the Arctic and locked the entire North European plain in a vault of cold. But then, slowly, as all great changes happen in geologic time, the world began to warm. It was not a sudden thaw, not a dramatic crack of ice echoing across valleys. It was a whisper in the wind, a faint softening at the edges, a drop in the relentless pressure of the ice. Around 14,000 years ago, the glacier's southern edge began to retreat northward, melting away in the pale light of a new epoch. As it withdrew, it did not simply vanish. It carved. It sculpted. It left behind a gift-wrapped landscape of rolling hills, deep fjords, and gently sloping plains, all shaped by the memory of its passage. The land that emerged was raw, wet, and strangely alive. Imagine standing on this newborn earth, bare feet on gravel still damp from meltwater, breath visible in the sharp air. You are among the first humans to witness this place. The ground beneath you is not yet soil, but outwashed sand, glacial till, and shattered limestone scraped clean from ancient bedrock. To the west, the North Sea is still finding its shape. To the east, the Baltic is swelling into a brackish inland sea. There are no trees yet, only hardy mosses, lichens, and patches of dwarf willow clinging to life in sheltered hollows. The sky is enormous, empty of smoke or contrails, filled only with the cries of migrating birds and the wind sighing over open tundra. This is the world of the Maglemosian people, Denmark's first known inhabitants. They arrived not as settlers with plows and plans, but as hunter-gatherers moving with the seasons, tracking the herds and reading the land like a language only they could understand. Archaeologists date their presence in southern Scandinavia to around 11,500 BCE, shortly after the ice receded enough to allow human passage. They followed reindeer northward as the climate warmed, then adapted as forests slowly replaced tundra. The Maglemosians were masters of survival in a world without walls. Their tools, meticulously fashioned from flint, bone, and antler, speak of intimate knowledge. Flint blades, knapped with such precision they could shave hair. Barbed harpoons, carved from red deer antler, designed to lodge in fish flesh. Wooden paddles and dugout canoes found preserved in peat bogs, proving they navigated Denmark's countless lakes and rivers, not as obstacles, but as highways. One of the most remarkable discoveries comes from Mullerup on the island of Zealand. There, in waterlogged sediments, archaeologists uncovered a 10,000-year-old fishing net, made not of rope, but of twisted willow bark. It was weighted with stones and staked along a lakeshore, evidence of sophisticated, cooperative hunting. Nearby, bone points and fishhooks suggest they targeted pike, perch, and even sea trout that swam up from the Kattegat. Their homes were temporary but thoughtful. Not crude lean-tos, but semi-subterranean huts, framed with hazel branches and covered with hides or reed mats. Hearths, lined with flat stones, sat at the center, radiating warmth into the cold Scandinavian nights. Around these fires, they must have told stories of the great aurochs that still roam the forests, of the bear whose tracks they followed, of the spirits they believed lived in the springs and stones. We find their beliefs not in temples, but in the things they buried. At Holmgard in central Zealand, 2 beautifully preserved bog bows were discovered, long, elegant hunting bows carved from elm, dated to around 7000 BCE. They were placed deliberately in a peat bog, not lost or discarded. In later centuries, the Danes would offer swords, cauldrons, and even human bodies to the bogs as sacrifices. Perhaps this tradition began here, with a hunter returning his most trusted tool to the earth that sustained him, in gratitude or ritual. Then came the Kongomose culture, around 6000 BCE, named after a site near the town of Kongomose on western Zealand. The climate had warmed further. Dense mixed forests of oak, elm, lime, and hazel covered the land. The reindeer had retreated north. In their place came red deer, wild boar, roe deer, and aurochs, massive, untamable ancestors of modern cattle, standing 2 meters tall at the shoulder. The Kongomose people adapted with ingenuity. Their flint tools grew more specialized. Transverse arrowheads for hunting, axes for woodworking, scrapers for preparing hides. They hunted in groups, driving animals into natural traps or ambushing them at forest clearings. They also fished more intensively, using weirs and traps in rivers, and gathering shellfish along the coasts. And their social world expanded. Evidence from burial sites suggests emerging distinctions in status. At one grave near Vedbak, a woman was buried with a necklace of over 100 amber beads. Amber, that golden fossilized resin washed ashore from the Baltic. To collect so many required time, trade, or luck. Perhaps she was a healer, perhaps a storyteller, or perhaps she simply had a keen eye for beauty in a world that offered little comfort. By 5400 BCE, a new wave of people arrived, not from the north, but from the south. These were farmers. They brought with them something the hunter-gatherers had never known: domesticated plants and animals, wheat, barley, cattle, pigs, and sheep, seeds of a revolution that would slowly, irreversibly, transform Denmark from a land of wanderers into a land of fields and fences. This marks the beginning of the Neolithic period, and the rise of the funnel beaker culture, named for their distinctive pottery with funnel-shaped tops. But between the last Maglemosians and the first farmers, there was a transitional people, the Ertebel culture, flourishing from around 5400 to 3950 BCE, just before farming took hold. They are Denmark's final hunter-gatherers, and among its most fascinating. Centered along the coasts of Jutland and the Danish islands, the Ertebel people lived in semi-permanent settlements, often on elevated ground near rich estuaries. They did not farm, but they were not primitive. Their villages contained large wooden longhouses, some over 15 meters long, with central hearths and post-hole patterns suggesting organized interior space. At Tybrandt Vig on Funen, divers discovered a submerged site that had once been a riverside camp. There, preserved in silt, lay a 7,000-year-old dugout canoe, complete with paddles, fishing lines, and even a bark container that once held nettle soup. They were expert mariners. Isotopic analysis of their bones shows that over 50% of their diet came from the sea: cod, flatfish, seals, porpoises, even whales that washed ashore. They used fish weirs, leasters, multi-pronged spears, and bone hooks. But they also hunted deer in the forests and gathered hazelnuts, berries, and wild greens, and they feasted. At Norsminde Fjord, archaeologists uncovered a massive shell mid in a refuse heap over 200 meters long, containing millions of oyster, cockle, and mussel shells, alongside bones of deer, boar, and birds. This was not just a dump, it was a gathering place. A seasonal banquet hall where communities came together to eat, trade, and perhaps mark rites of passage. They also buried their dead with care. At Vedbak, near Copenhagen, a cemetery revealed graves with striking emotional depth. In one, a young woman lay with a newborn infant, cradled on a swan's wing. In another, a man was buried with a flint axe and red ochre sprinkled over his body, a pigment often associated with rebirth or ritual. These were not hasty interments. They were acts of love, memory, and belief in something beyond death. Did they know about farming? Almost certainly. Pottery fragments from southern Sweden and northern Germany regions already practicing agriculture have been found in Ertebel sites. They may have traded with farmers, or observe them from a distance. Yet for centuries, they chose to remain hunter-gatherers. Was it tradition? Was it that the coastal bounty was too rich to abandon? Or did they sense something in the farmer's life, the backbreaking labor of tilling soil, the confinement of village life, the loss of freedom that they were not ready to accept? We cannot know. But around 3,950 BCE, the Ertugrul way of life vanished. Not through conquest, but through absorption. The Funnelbeaker farmers expanded northward, bringing plows, domesticated animals, and a new social order. Within a few generations, the old ways faded. The shell middens were abandoned. The dugout canoes rotted in riverbeds. The last hunter-gatherer died, and no one remembered how to knap a perfect flint blade. Yet their legacy endured in the DNA of modern Danes, in the coastline they knew so well, and in the quiet reverence for the sea that still runs through Danish culture. The land they walked was soft, young, still settling after the weight of ice. The forests were deep, the winters long, the summers brief but brilliant. There were no borders, no nations, no concept of Denmark. Only people moving through a world of water, wood, and wind, listening, adapting, surviving. And in the silence between the bird calls and the rustle of leaves, you can almost hear them still knapping flint by a fire, singing to their children, offering thanks to the bog for another day of life. This was Denmark's first dawn, not with fanfare, not with flags or anthems, but with a single footprint in wet clay, left by someone who did not know they were making history, only that they had to keep walking. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the low, golden light of a summer evening in what we now call Zealand, Denmark's largest island, around 1,500 BCE. The air is still warm, carrying the scent of blooming meadowsweet and damp earth from the nearby fjord. There are no roads, no fences, no towns, only open fields, scattered groves of oak and hazel, and the soft hush of wind moving through tall grass. But if you listen carefully beyond the chirp of crickets and the distant cry of a heron, you might hear something else. The rhythmic ring of metal on metal, a hammer striking bronze. This is the sound of a new age. For over 1,000 years, Denmark's people had lived with stone, bone, and wood. Their tools, weapons, and ornaments were shaped from what the earth and animals gave them freely. But now, something extraordinary had arrived, not from local forests or rivers, but from far beyond the horizon: bronze, an alloy of copper and tin. It was harder than pure copper, sharper than flint, and capable of holding an edge that could cut through hide, wood, and even bone with astonishing ease. But bronze did not exist naturally in Denmark. Neither copper nor tin could be mined here in any meaningful quantity. So how did it arrive? Through trade. Long before Denmark was a nation, it was a crossroads. Archaeological evidence shows that by 1700 BCE, Danish communities were deeply embedded in a vast European exchange network that stretched from the mines of Cornwall in Britain to the Carpathian Mountains of modern-day Romania, and even as far as the eastern Mediterranean. Amber, Denmark's golden treasure, washed ash to its shores from ancient Baltic forests, was the key. To the elites of Mycenaean Greece, Minoan Crete, and Central Europe, amber was not just decorative. It was sacred. Warm to the touch, electric when rubbed, luminous in firelight, it was believed to contain the essence of the sun, captured in resin. In Denmark, sitting at the northern edge of the known world, controlled access to it. In return for sacks of raw amber, Danish chieftains received bronze ingots, finished weapons, jewelry, and perhaps even stories, tales of palaces with frescoed walls, of ships with sails, of gods who walked among men. This exchange did more than bring metal. It brought ideas, status, and a new social order. Society began to stratify. Where once leadership may have rested with the best hunter or the wisest elder, power now flowed to those who controlled bronze. They were the ones who could forge axes, swords, and razors, not just for utility, but for display. A man buried with a bronze sword wasn't just armed. He was announcing his connection to distant worlds, his access to rare wealth, his divine favor. And nowhere is this clearer than in the burial mounds that still dot the Danish countryside, over 50,000 of them from the Bronze Age alone. These were not graves for common folk. Take the Borum Eshoi Barrow near Aarhus. When archaeologists opened it in the 19th century, they found a wooden burial chamber containing 3 bodies: an elderly man, a younger woman, and a child. The man lay on a woolen blanket, dressed in a finely woven cap and leather shoes stitched with care. Beside him was a bronze dagger, a horn drinking cup, and a lure, a long, curved bronze horn, used not for war, but for ritual music. The woman wore a bronze belt plate, a necklace of amber beads, and a sleeve guard made of woven wool, perhaps used while spinning or weaving, activities tied to elite women's roles. Isotopic analysis later revealed she was not local. She had grown up in Central Europe, likely brought to Denmark through marriage alliance. This was diplomacy in human form. Then there is the Egtved girl, discovered in 1,921 inches, southern Jutland, buried around 1,370 BCE. She was only 16 to 18 years old, yet her grave speaks of high status. She lay in a coffin hollowed from an oak log, her body wrapped in a short blouse and skirt made of wool, remarkably preserved by the acidic, oxygen-poor conditions of the peat. Her hair was styled in a loose bob, held by a bronze pin. On her right arm, a spiral bronze bracelet. At her feet, a bark bucket that once held mead, a fermented honey drink reserved for ritual and elite consumption. But the most astonishing detail? A small pouch tied to her belt contained cremated ashes of a child, likely her own. Was this a stillborn infant? A child who died shortly after birth? We cannot know for certain, but its inclusion suggests deep emotional bonds and a belief that the afterlife required family to be whole. Her coffin lid was sealed, but carved into the wood was a solar wheel, a circle with 4 spokes. This was no decoration. It was a cosmogram. For the people of the Nordic Bronze Age, the sun was not just a celestial body. It was a living god, a divine force that traveled across the sky by day in a chariot pulled by horses and sailed through the underworld by night in a ship. This cyclical journey, birth, death, rebirth, mirrored the seasons, agriculture, and human life itself. We know this not from written texts. Writing would not arrive for another 1,500 years, but from art. Thousands of raw carvings survive across Scandinavia on flat stones in Bohuslän, Sweden, in Tanum, and along the Danish coasts. They show ships with crews of up to 20 oarsmen, horses pulling wheeled vehicles, plowing scenes, and warriors with raised axes. But most common of all, the sun disk. Often, it appears atop a ship. Sometimes, it is held by twin figures, perhaps twin gods, like the divine twins Njord and Freyr, later described in Norse myth. In some carvings, the sun is carried by a swan, a bird associated with transformation and the soul. And then there are the lures. Over 50 pairs of these bronze horns have been found in Danish bogs, deliberately deposited, never in graves, never in settlements. They are long, up to 2 meters, elegantly curved, with decorated mouthpieces and ornate end plates, often showing ships, animals, or abstract spirals. When played, they produce a deep, resonant tone that can carry for kilometers across open land. Were they used in battle? Unlikely. They lack practicality in combat. Instead, they were ritual instruments, sounding during solstices, funerals, or harvest festivals to summon the gods, honor the dead, or accompany the sun's journey. One famous pair, the Brudevalte lures, was found near a lake in northern Zealand. Their tone is so perfectly tuned that modern orchestras have replicated them. To hear a lure played at dawn is to feel the ground vibrate not just in your ears, but in your bones. This was sound as sacred technology, but bronze was not only for the elite dead, it shaped daily life. Consider the bronze razors found in male graves across southern Scandinavia, often shaped like ships or horses. These were not mere grooming tools. They were ritual objects, symbols of transition perhaps used in rites of passage marking a boy's entry into manhood. Many are too delicate for actual shaving, suggesting their value was symbolic. Similarly, belt plates, pins, and arm rings were worn not just for utility, but to signal identity. A man with spiral decorated arm rings was broadcasting his lineage, his access to trade, his place in the cosmic order. And then, there is warfare. While the Bronze Age in Denmark was not defined by constant conflict, weapons were abundant. Sword hilts with intricate casting, spearheads designed for thrusting or throwing, and shields made of wood and reinforced with bronze bosses all appear in graves and bogs. But here's the mystery. Very few show signs of combat. This suggests that weapons, like razors and lures, were often votive or ceremonial. A warrior's status came not from how many enemies he killed, but from how beautifully his gear reflected the sun, and by extension, the divine. Conflict likely existed, territorial disputes, raids over livestock, but large-scale warfare seems rare. The society's energy went not into destruction, but into creation. Building mounds, forging metal, weaving cloth, composing songs, and at the heart of it all was the home. Most people lived in longhouses, timber-frame structures up to 30 meters long, with walls of wattle and daub, thatched roofs, and central hearths. Inside, families, animals, and tools shared space, just as in the earlier Neolithic. But now, the hearth might be lined with soapstone bowls, the walls hung with bronze hooks, and the loom weighted with clay or stone loom weights stamped with geometric patterns. Women spun wool into yarn using drop spindles, dyed it with plant-based pigments wove for blue, madder for red, and wove intricate textiles. Microscopic analysis of fabric fragments from graves like Egtved shows stripes, plaids, and even embroidery proof of advanced textile knowledge. Children played with clay figurines and bone flutes. Elders told stories by the fire, perhaps about the great hero who rode the sun chariot, or the sea serpent that guarded the amber shores. And always, the landscape spoke back. The Danes of this age did not see nature as passive. Trees had spirits. Springs were portals. Hills were the backs of sleeping giants. This animistic worldview fused with solar worship to create a deeply ritualized relationship with the environment, which brings us to the bogs. Unlike later Iron Age peoples who sacrificed humans to the bogs, Bronze Age deposits are almost exclusively objects. Broken swords, bent axes, twisted arm rings, and shattered pottery. These were not lost or discarded. They were intentionally destroyed before being placed in the water. Why? One theory. Killing the object released its spirit, allowing it to serve the gods in the next world. Another. It prevented the object from being reused by the living, preserving its sacred power. Whatever the reason, the act was communal. Dropping a bronze sword into a bog was not a quiet gesture. It was a public declaration, a ritual that bound the community to the land and the divine. By 800 BCE, this golden age began to fade. The climate cooled. Tree lines retreated. Harvests became uncertain. Trade routes shifted. And a new material arrived: iron. Harder, more abundant, and locally smeltable, iron would soon replace bronze for tools and weapons. But it lacked bronze's luster, its sacred gleam. The sun religion waned. The mounds grew fewer. The lures fell silent. Yet the legacy endured. The Bronze Age Danes left no written records, no cities, no empires, but they left something more intimate. A world shaped by light, sound, and ritual. Their graves whisper of love, loss, and cosmic wonder. Their art sings of journeys across sky and sea. Their metal still gleams in museum cases, warm as living skin. And on certain mornings, when the mist rises off the fjords and the first rays of sun strike the dew-laden grass, you can almost hear the distant echo of a lure, low, solemn, and utterly human, calling the world awake once more. The bronze gleam faded slowly, not with a crash, but with a whisper of rust. By 500 BCE, Denmark's golden age of sun worship and ceremonial horns had begun to dim. The climate cooled. The great trade routes that once carried amber south and bronze north grew thinner, more fragile. And from the forests of Central Europe, a new metal arrived: iron. Unlike bronze, iron was not imported. It was local. Found in the bogs as nodules of bog iron, spongy, rust-red lumps formed by bacterial action. Iron could be smelted right here in clay furnaces built beside streams or in forest clearings. It didn't shine like the sun. It was dark, heavy, and stubborn, but it was stronger, sharper, more practical. And in the hands of a skilled smith, it could be forged into tools and weapons that lasted longer and cut deeper than anything bronze could manage. This wasn't just a technological shift. It was a social revolution. Where bronze had been the currency of elites, hoarded, displayed, ritually destroyed iron was democratic. A farmer could own an iron axe. A fisherman could carry an iron knife. A warrior could wield an iron spear without needing amber or distant connections. Power began to decentralize. And so began the Iron Age, a long, complex epoch that would stretch for over 1,500 years, culminating in the era we now call the Viking Age. But the story doesn't start with longships or raids. It starts with bodies in bogs. In the peatlands of Jutland and Funen, archaeologists have uncovered dozens of human remains, men, women, even children, carefully placed in watery graves over 2,000 years ago. These are not ordinary burials. They are sacrifices. The most famous is Talland Man, discovered in 1950 near Silkeborg. He lay curled on his side, as if asleep, his face so perfectly preserved by the acidic, oxygen-poor peat that you can still see the stubble on his chin, the furrow in his brow, the leather noose around his neck. Carbon dating places his death around 400 BCE. He was likely 30 to 40 years old, healthy, well-fed. His last meal? A gruel of barley, flax, and wild weed seeds. Not a feast, but a ritual offering. Nearby, Graball Man was found with his throat slit so deeply his head nearly severed. His hands were bound, his hair neatly trimmed, and Elling Woman, discovered just a kilometer from Talland Man, had been hanged with a braided leather rope and laid gently in the bog. Her hair, intricately braided into a long ponytail, wound around her head, a style that would not become common in Denmark for another 2,000 years. What do these deaths tell us? They reveal a society deeply entwined with ritual, violence, and the sacred landscape. The bogs were not dumping grounds. They were temples, watery portals to the gods. Offering a human life, especially one who showed no signs of struggle, was the highest form of devotion. Perhaps these were criminals, perhaps volunteers, or perhaps they were chosen by lot during times of crisis, famine, plague, or the threat of invasion. One thing is clear: these were not random acts. They were performances of cosmic balance, and they continued for centuries. As the Iron Age unfolded, Denmark fractured into a patchwork of petty kingdoms, each ruled by a chieftain whose power rested not on divine right, but on wealth, warriors, and reputation. We know this from archaeology, because for most of this period until the 8th century CE, the Danes left no written records. Their history was oral, sung by skalds around fires, remembered in place names like Gudme, home of the gods, on Funen, or Ledre on Zealand, which later sagas would call the seat of legendary kings. At Gudme, excavations since the 1982 have revealed a vast settlement covering over 50 hectares, one of the largest in northern Europe between 200 and 500 CE. There were workshops for goldsmiths, evidence of imported Roman glass, and over 2,000 gold objects found in nearby fields, coins, bracteates, thin gold medallions, and jewelry stamped with runes and images of gods. This was no village. It was a ritual and economic center, where elites gathered to trade, feast, and reaffirm alliances. And then came the Romans. Not as conquerors, Denmark lay far beyond the empire's northern frontier, but as trading partners and distant observers. In 98 CE, the Roman historian Tacitus wrote a short ethnography called Germania, describing the peoples of northern Europe. Among them, he mentioned the Cimbri, a tribe said to have lived on a peninsula jutting into the sea, likely Jutland. According to Roman accounts, the Cimbri and their allies, the Teutones, once migrated south in a mass movement around 113 BCE, terrifying the Republic with their size and ferocity. They were eventually defeated by the general Gaius Marius, but their legend endured. Did the Cimbri originate in Denmark? Archaeological evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. Massive earthworks, like the Danevirke, a defensive wall across southern Jutland, were once thought to date from this era, but modern radiocarbon dating places its earliest construction closer to 650 CE. Still, Roman coins, weapons, and luxury goods have been found in Danish graves from the 1st to 4th centuries CE, proving contact existed. A Roman wine strainer in a chieftain's grave in Hoby on Lolland. A bronze cauldron from the Mediterranean in a mound on Zealand. These were not souvenirs. They were prestige items, symbols of connection to the greatest empire the world had ever known. By the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire collapsed, trade routes shifted, and Scandinavia entered the migration period, a time of upheaval, population movement, and cultural fusion. In Denmark, settlements like Gudme declined. New power centers emerged, and the first runes appeared. The Elder Futhark, an alphabet of 24 characters, was carved into weapons, jewelry, and stones. One of the oldest examples comes from Vimose on Funen, a comb inscribed with the word Harja, possibly a name or title, dated to 160 CE. Runes were not just writing, they were magic. Carving a rune was an act of power, invoking protection, cursing enemies, or honoring the dead. The word rune itself means secret or mystery, but literacy remained rare. Most communication was still oral. Then, around 550 CE, something changed. The climate cooled again. The late antique Little Ice Age triggered by volcanic eruptions that dimmed the sun for years. Crops failed, populations shrank, and in this stress, a new social order crystallized. We see it in the burial mounds of the Merovingian period, 500–750 CE. At Jelling, in central Jutland, a massive barrow known as the North Mound was raised around 700 CE. When excavated, it revealed a wooden chamber with a horse-drawn wagon, sacrificed dogs, and a man buried with weapons and imported goods. He was likely a local king, a warlord who controlled land, warriors, and trade. This was the world just before the Vikings, a patchwork of kingdoms, a warrior elite, a landscape dotted with sacred groves, burial mounds, and ritual lakes. A people who spoke Old Norse, worshipped Odin and Thor, and measured honor and courage, generosity and fame. And then, in 793 CE, everything changed. On a cold June day, 3 ships appeared off the coast of Lindisfarne, a holy island off northeast England. They were not traders. They were raiders. They burned the monastery, slaughtered monks, and carried off gold, silver, and slaves. The attack sent shockwaves through Christendom. A Northumbrian scholar wrote in horror, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race." These were the Danes, or at least, people from what we now call Denmark. And so began the Viking Age. But to call them just raiders is to miss the full picture. The Vikings were farmers, traders, explorers, craftsmen, poets, and settlers. Raiding was only one part of their economy, a high-risk, high-reward strategy for young men seeking wealth and status in a society where inheritance went to the eldest son. Their secret? The longship. No vessel before or since combined speed, shallow draft, and seaworthiness so perfectly. Built from overlapping oak planks, clinker-built, caulked with wool and tar, and powered by both square sail and oars, the longship could cross open ocean, then glide up rivers so shallow it could land on a beach. The Skúdalef ships, discovered in a fjord north of Roskilde, and deliberately sunk around 1070 CE to block a channel, give us a full spectrum. Skúdalef II, a 30-meter warship built in Dublin around 1040. 2. Capable of carrying 70-80 warriors at speeds up to 15 knots. Skúdalef III, a coastal trader, 14 meters long, used for short-haul cargo. Skúdalef V, a small warship, likely used for local defense, fast and maneuverable. These were not crude boats. They were masterpieces of naval engineering, shaped with adzes and augers by craftsmen who understood the flex of wood in storm and swell. And they carried the Danes far. From Lindisfarne, raids spread to Scotland, Ireland, France, and even Spain. But the Danes also traded. At Hedeby, modern-day Haithabu, on the Schlei Fjord, they built Scandinavia's largest town, a bustling port where amber, furs, slaves, and walrus ivory flowed in, and glass beads, wine, and silver coins flowed out. Excavations reveal 1,500 houses, a semicircular harbor, and streets lined with workshops. A merchant might sell soapstone bowls from Norway, silk from Byzantium, and Frankish swords all in a single morning. Nearby Ribe, founded around 700 CE, is even older, the oldest town in Denmark. Its comb makers, bead makers, and metal workers left behind molds, slag, and thousands of everyday objects. This was urban Denmark, emerging not by royal decree, but by economic necessity. The Danes also settled. In England, they established the Danelaw, a region from Yorkshire to East Anglia, where Danish law, language, and customs held sway. Place names ending in by, village, thorp, hamlet, and toft, homestead, still dot the map. In Normandy, a Viking leader named Rollo was granted land by the French king in 911 CE, founding a duchy that would one day produce William the Conqueror. And in the North Atlantic, they sailed farther, to the Faroe Islands, to Iceland, to Greenland, and finally, around 1000 CE, to Vinland, North America. At Les Aux Meadows in Newfoundland, archaeologists found the remains of Norse longhouses, iron nails, and a bronze cloak pin, proof that Leif Erikson and his crew reached the continent 500 years before Columbus. But at home, Denmark was unifying. In the 9th and 10th centuries, a dynasty emerged, the House of Gorm, based at Jelling. Gorm the Old, the first historically verified king, ruled a realm that likely included Jutland and the Danish islands. His son, Harold Bluetooth, would change everything. Around 965 CE, Harold raised a rune stone at Jelling so massive it's called Denmark's birth certificate. It reads, "King Harold commanded this monument made in memory of Gorm, his father, and in memory of Thyra, his mother." That Harold who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. This is not just propaganda. It's a political manifesto. Harold didn't just convert. He imposed Christianity as a tool of state building, replacing fragmented pagan loyalties with a single faith tied to the crown. The Jelling stone shows Jesus on one side, and on the other, a great beast swallowing a warrior, perhaps a nod to Odin's wolf, Fenrir, now tamed by the cross. Christianity spread slowly. Many Danes practiced both burying their dead with crosses and Thor's hammers. But the old gods faded. Odin, the one-eyed wanderer who sacrificed himself on Yggdrasil to gain wisdom. Thor, the red-bearded protector who wielded Mjolnir and fought giants. Freyja, the goddess of love and war who rode a chariot pulled by cats. Their stories lived on in poetry, the Poetic Edda, the Prose Edda, but their temples fell silent. By 1050 CE, the Viking Age ended not with a battle, but with a baptism. Denmark was now a Christian kingdom, integrated into European politics, building stone churches, minting coins, and sending bishops to Rome. The longships still sailed, but their purpose had changed. From raid to trade, from saga to scripture, from Odin to Christ. Yet the Viking spirit endured in the resilience of Danish farmers, in the seafaring pride of coastal towns, in the quiet strength of a people who had once ruled the northern seas. And if you walk the shores of Roskilde Fjord today, where the Viking Ship Museum displays the Skåldelev wrecks, you can still feel it, the whisper of oars on water, the creak of oak, the distant call of a horn. Not a cry of war, but a song of homecoming. The old gods did not vanish in a single night. Their departure was slow, like the tide receding from a shore at dawn, leaving behind only glistening traces in the sand. In the years just before and after 965 CE, Denmark stood at a threshold. For centuries, its people had worshipped beneath open skies. Thor with his hammer that guarded farmsteads from storm and sickness. Odin, the wanderer god, who demanded sacrifice in exchange for wisdom and victory. Freyja, who wept golden tears for her lost husband and rode a chariot pulled by cats through realms unseen. Their presence was felt in sacred groves like Upokra in Scania, then part of Denmark, where archaeologists have uncovered centuries of ritual deposits, weapons bent in offering, gold bracteates stamped with divine symbols, and the remains of feasts shared between the living and the unseen. But now, a new power was rising not from the earth or the sky, but from the south. Christianity had long brushed against Denmark's edges. Missionaries like Ansgar, the Apostle of the North, had visited in the 9th century, building a small wooden church in Hedeby and baptizing a few converts. But their efforts were fragile, often reversed when kings changed or crops failed. Faith in the old gods was tied to survival. To abandon Thor was to risk storms, blight, or invasion. Everything changed with Harald Bluetooth, born around 910 CE, son of Gorm the Old and Thyra. Harald inherited a patchwork of chiefdoms loosely held together by kinship, fealty, and force. But he dreamed of more. He wanted a unified kingdom, one that could stand beside the empires of Saxony, England, and Francia, not as a pagan backwater, but as a recognized Christian realm. And so, around 965 CE, on the windswept plain of Jelling in central Jutland, he raised two stones that would echo through history. The older stone, raised for his father, Gorm, bore a simple inscription in runes. King Gorm made this mound in memory of Thyra, his wife, Denmark's adornment. But Harald's own stone, massive, nearly 2.5 meters tall, carved with intricate interlacing beasts and a Christ figure, declared something far bolder. King Harald commanded this monument made in memory of Gorm, his father, and in memory of Thyra, his mother. That Harald, who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian, this was not mere boast. It was statecraft in stone. By claiming to have won all of Denmark, Harald was asserting centralized rule over lands that had once been ruled by rival chieftains. By declaring his conversion and the conversion of his people, he was aligning Denmark with the Christian powers of Europe, opening trade, diplomacy, and legitimacy. And the timing was no accident. Just a decade earlier, the Holy Roman Emperor Otto I had crushed a massive pagan Slavic uprising in 955 CE at the Battle of Lechfeld, cementing Christian dominance in Central Europe. Otto's son, Otto II, was now emperor, and he expected loyalty from neighboring rulers. Harald, ever pragmatic, chose baptism not out of sudden piety, but political survival. Yet, the transition was not smooth. Archaeology reveals a society in religious flux. At the trading town of Ribe, excavations show that by the late 10th century, Christian graves appear alongside pagan ones, some with crosses, others with Thor's hammers. In Viborg, The old pagan assembly site became the location of a cathedral, built directly atop the sacred mound where laws had once been recited under Odin's eye. Even Harold's own burial reflects this tension. Though he raised a Christian crossstone, his body was laid to rest, not in a churchyard, but in a great wooden burial chamber beneath the North Mound at Jelling, surrounded by sacrificed animals and grave goods, in the manner of his forebears. Only later, perhaps under his son Sweyn Forkbeard, was his body moved to a Christian church. Faith, it seemed, was a garment worn over older bones. Harold's reign also saw the construction of the first Trelleborg circular, geometrically precise fortresses scattered across Denmark and southern Sweden. Built with astonishing speed and symmetry, these were not just military installations, but symbols of royal power. At Agersborg, the largest, the fortress could house over 1,000 men and dominate the Limfjord, a vital waterway. These fortresses suggest that Harold's rule was not universally accepted. He needed garrisons to hold the realm together. But after his death sometime around 987 CE, Denmark fractured once more. His son, Sweyn Forkbeard, rebelled. According to later sagas, Sweyn either killed Harold in battle or drove him into exile, where he died in Pomerania, modern-day Poland. Whether true or embellished, the message is clear. Christian unity was fragile. Sweyn, though baptized, leaned back toward pagan alliances, but his ambitions were not religious, they were imperial. In 1013, after decades of raiding and diplomacy, Sweyn launched a full-scale invasion of England. The Anglo-Saxon king Ethelred the Unready fled, and Sweyn was proclaimed King of England, the first Danish ruler to hold both crowns. He died just 5 weeks later, but his dream lived on in his son, Canute the Great. Born around 990 CE, Canute was raised in a world where Danish power stretched from the Baltic to the North Sea. After inheriting the Danish throne in 1018, he defeated his rivals in England by 1016 and added Norway by 1028. For a brief, brilliant moment, he ruled a North Sea empire, the largest realm in Northern Europe. Canute was a Christian king, deeply aware of his image. He made pilgrimages to Rome, corresponded with popes, and issued laws that blended Danish custom with Christian morality. In 1027, he wrote a letter to his English subjects declaring, "I have vowed to God to live a righteous life, and to maintain justice and peace for all." Yet he never forgot his roots. He kept Danish law in Denmark, English law in England, and Norse traditions in Norway. He ruled not as a foreign conqueror, but as a king of many peoples, fluent in their tongues, respectful of their customs. But empires built on one man rarely outlive him. When Canute died in 1035, his realm splintered. His sons Harthacnut in Denmark, Harold Harefoot in England fought for supremacy. By 1042, the English throne returned to the Anglo-Saxon line. Norway broke away. Denmark shrank back to its core. For the next 2 centuries, Denmark was racked by civil wars. Succession was not automatic. Upon a king's death, nobles would gather at the Thing, the ancient assembly, and choose a new ruler from among the royal family. This often meant violence. Between 1042 and 1157, Denmark saw at least 12 kings, many of whom died by murder, battle, or exile. Yet, out of this chaos emerged a new kind of monarchy. In 1157, after decades of infighting, Valdemar I, of a murdered prince and raised in exile, seized the throne with the help of his close friend and advisor Absalon, the Bishop of Roskilde. Together, they began to rebuild. Absalon was no ordinary cleric. He was a warrior bishop, leading fleets against the Wends Slavic pirates who raided Danish coasts from bases like Rügen and Arkona. In 1168, Absalon's forces stormed the great pagan temple at Arkona, destroyed the wooden idol of Svetovid, and baptized the survivors. It was the final blow to organized paganism in the Baltic. Under Valdemar and Absalon, Denmark entered a golden age of consolidation. They built stone churches replacing wooden stave chapels with enduring Romanesque architecture. They established dioceses across the land, bringing literacy, Latin, and ecclesiastical law. They codified Danish law, most famously the Jyske Lov, Law of Jutland, in 1241, which declared, "By law shall the land be ruled, not by the will of the king." This was revolutionary, a check on royal power, rooted in Christian justice and communal tradition. And they fortified the realm, the Danevirke. That ancient earthwork across southern Jutland was rebuilt in stone. Watchtowers rose, coastal defenses strengthened. For the first time, Denmark had borders not just zones of influence, but lines to be defended. By the late 13th century, Denmark was a medieval kingdom in the full European sense. Christian, feudal, literate, and centralized. But its greatest test was still to come. In 1319, a crisis of succession threatened to undo everything. The male line of Valdemar's dynasty ended. Nobles turned to Christopher II, but he was weak. And when he tried to tax the church and nobility to fund defense, they rebelled. By 1326, he was deposed. The kingdom was mortgaged to German counts. Castles were held by foreign lords. For a decade, Denmark ceased to exist as a sovereign state. It was rescued not by a warrior, but by a woman. Margaret I, born in 1353, daughter of Valdemar IV Atterdag. The king who had begun reclaiming Danish lands was married at 10 to Håkon VI of Norway. When her husband and son died, she became regent of both Denmark and Norway. Then, in 1389, she defeated the Swedish king Albert of Mecklenburg at the Battle of Osle, and took control of Sweden as well. On the 17th of June, 1397, in the Grand Cathedral of Kalmar, Margaret crowned her grandnephew, Eric of Pomerania, as king of all three realms. But everyone knew the real ruler was Margaret herself. The Kalmar Union was born a united Scandinavia under one crown, designed to resist the growing power of the Hanseatic League and German princes. Margaret did not seek glory. She sought stability. She reformed taxes, reclaimed crown lands, and built a navy. She ruled from Kalundborg and Copenhagen, not from battlefields, but from council chambers. When she died in 1412, she left behind a legacy not of conquest, but of quiet, unbreakable unity. Denmark was no longer a land of chieftains shouting oaths under oak trees. It was a kingdom baptized in blood and faith, forged in war and law, and now bound to its neighbors in a union that would shape the North for over a century. The cross had not erased the hammer, but it had reshaped the hand that held it. The year is 1400. You stand on the windswept coast of Zealand, just south of the growing port town of Copenhagen. The air smells of salt, tar, and drying herring. Gulls cry overhead, and the rhythmic creak of ship timbers blends with the low murmur of merchants haggling in Low German, the lingua franca of the North Sea. This is not the Denmark of Harald Bluetooth or Valdemar the Great. This is a kingdom woven into a larger fabric, bound by oath, blood, and ambition to Norway and Sweden, in a union forged not by conquest, but by vision. The Kalmar Union, named for the Swedish town, where it was sealed in 1397, was the brainchild of Margaret I, a woman who never took the title of queen, yet ruled as the undisputed sovereign of all three realms. She was not a warrior in armor. She was a ruler in black wool, sitting in council chambers, drafting charters, and weighing alliances with the quiet precision of a master weaver. Under her, Denmark did not dominate. It anchored. Copenhagen, once a modest fishing village, became the administrative heart of the Union. Stone buildings rose around the harbor. The bishop's palace grew grander. Customs duties flowed into royal coffers. And Danish nobles long accustomed to regional power found themselves part of a trans-Scandinavian elite, marrying Norwegian heiresses, holding Swedish fiefs, and sending their sons to study in Paris or Prague. But unity was fragile. Sweden, in particular, chafed. Its nobility resented Danish officials. Its peasants feared conscription into distant wars. Its miners in Bergslagen, the richest iron region in northern Europe, watched as Union tariffs favored Danish merchants over local interests. Norway, by contrast, grew Keter, once a seafaring power with colonies in Iceland, Greenland, and the Faroes. Norway had been weakened by the Black Death, which killed up to 60% of its population in 1350, with fewer people, fewer ships, and fewer warriors. It became the junior partner, politically absorbed, culturally preserved, but increasingly dependent. Margaret, ever pragmatic, allowed Norway to keep its laws, its assemblies, and its bishoprics. But real power flowed through Copenhagen and Kalundborg, where she held court. When she died suddenly in 1412 aboard a ship in the harbor of Flensburg, possibly of plague, she left no direct heir. Her chosen successor was Eric of Pomerania, her grandnephew, whom she had raised from childhood and crowned as king of all three realms at Kalmar. Eric was intelligent, pious, and stubborn. He dreamed of a unified Scandinavia strong enough to challenge the Hanseatic League, the powerful merchant confederation that controlled Baltic trade from Lubeck to Novgorod. But he misunderstood the nature of power in the north. Where Margaret ruled through consensus, Eric ruled through decree. He imposed heavy taxes to build a navy. He clashed with the Hanseatic cities over tolls in the Øresund, the narrow strait between Denmark and Sweden where every ship had to pay to pass. He even tried to establish a rival trading hub at Falkenberg, angering Lubeck. And in 1426, he declared war on the Hanseatic League. The Dano-Hanseatic War lasted 22 years, one of the longest conflicts in Scandinavian history. At first, Eric's fleet held its own. Danish warships blockaded Wendish ports, privateers raided Hanseatic convoys. But the League had deeper pockets, stronger alliances, and a ruthless strategy: economic strangulation. They cut off grain imports to Scandinavia. They embargoed salt, iron, and wine. In Sweden, famine spread. In Norway, unrest simmered. By 1434, rebellion broke out not in a foreign land, but at home. A Swedish nobleman named Engelbrekt Engelbrektsson led a peasant and miner uprising against Danish bailiffs and union taxes. His cry was simple: Sweden for the Swedes. Though Engelbrekt was assassinated in 1436, his movement did not die. The Swedish Council of the Realm began acting independently, ignoring Eric's orders, minting their own coins, and negotiating directly with the Hanseatic cities. In Denmark, nobles grew impatient. They had supported Margaret because she protected their privileges. But Eric? He treated them like subjects, not partners. In 1439, the Danish and Swedish councils deposed him together. He fled to Gotland, where he held out in the fortress of Visby for another 12 years, a king without a kingdom, writing bitter letters to popes and emperors about betrayal. The union did not collapse, but it fractured. A new king was chosen, Christopher of Bavaria, a distant cousin with no strong ties to any one realm. He ruled gently, restoring peace with the Hanseatic League in 1441 and lowering taxes. But he died childless in 1448. And once again, the three kingdoms faced a succession crisis. This time, they chose differently. Denmark elected Christian I of the House of Oldenburg, a noble from northern Germany with Danish ties through his mother. Sweden, wary of Danish dominance, elected Karl Knudsen as their own king. Norway, caught in the middle, first chose Karl, then switched to Christian after political pressure. For a moment, the union held. But the cracks were spreading. Christian I, crowned in 1448, was a builder, not a warrior. He founded the University of Copenhagen in 1479, the first in Scandinavia modeled on those in Paris and Bologna. He expanded Copenhagen Castle. He strengthened the sound dues, the tolls on ships passing through the Øresund, which would become Denmark's single greatest source of royal income for the next 400 years. But he could not hold Sweden. In 1471, Karl Knutsson's forces were defeated at the Battle of Brunkeberg near Stockholm, but the victory went not to Christian, but to a new Swedish hero, Sten Sture the Elder, who ruled as regent in the name of a distant, symbolic king. Denmark and Sweden were now de facto separate, though the union's legal fiction persisted. Then came Hans, John, Christian's son, who became king in 1481. He tried diplomacy where his father had used force. In 1497, he was accepted as King of Sweden, briefly reuniting the three crowns. But by 1501, rebellion flared again. Sten Sture returned. Swedish castles shut their gates to Danish troops. The dream of unity was fading like a fresco in a damp church. And into this world of shifting loyalties and simmering tension came a monk from Wittenberg, Martin Luther. In 1517, he nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in Germany. The message spread like wildfire not just through books but through Danish merchants, German students, and discontented priests who saw in Luther's ideas a chance to challenge both Rome and royal control. Denmark was ripe for change. The Catholic Church owned up to 25% of all arable land in the kingdom. Bishops lived like princes. Monasteries hoarded silver, and tithes drained wealth from villages already struggling after decades of war and plague. Worse, the church was seen as foreign, loyal to the Pope in Rome, not the king in Copenhagen. King Christian II, who ruled from 1513, was a complex figure, brilliant, volatile, and deeply influenced by humanist ideals. He married a Burgundian princess, studied law in the Netherlands, and dreamed of a modern, centralized state. In 1520, he launched a final, desperate bid to reclaim Sweden. He besieged Stockholm, promised amnesty to his enemies, and then, upon victory, hosted a coronation banquet in the city. 3 days later, on November 8, he ordered the arrest of 82 Swedish nobles, bishops, and burghers. Over the next 3 days, November 8-10, they were beheaded in what became known as the Stockholm bloodbath. Christian claimed they were heretics and traitors, but the massacre backfired horribly. Instead of crushing resistance, it created a martyr, Gustav Vasa, whose father was among the slain. Gustav fled to Dalarna, rallied peasants with tales of Danish tyranny, and within 3 years, drove the Danes out of Sweden for good. In 1523, Sweden elected Gustav king, and the Kalmar Union was officially dead. Christian II, disgraced and deposed by his own Danish nobles, fled into exile. His uncle, Frederick I, took the Danish throne. And Frederick had no love for the old church or the old order. Though nominally Catholic, he allowed Lutheran preachers to speak in Danish towns. One of them was Hans Tausen, a former monk trained in Wittenberg. Tausen preached in Viborg, once a pagan assembly site, now a Christian bishopric calling for worship in the Danish language, for communion in both bread and wine, not just bread, as Rome dictated, and for the abolition of monastic vows. Crowds gathered, nobles listened. Even the king's son, Christian, showed interest. The Reformation in Denmark was not a revolution. It was a royal takeover. In 1536, after a brief civil war known as the Count's Feud, a conflict between Catholic loyalists and Lutheran reformers, Frederick's son Christian III emerged victorious. On the 30th of October 1536, he summoned the Danish bishops to Copenhagen Castle and had them arrested. Not executed, not exiled. Simply stripped of their titles and lands. Their estates, vast farms, forests, and manors were confiscated by the crown. The Catholic Church in Denmark ceased to exist overnight. In its place rose the Church of Denmark, a Lutheran state church with the king as its supreme authority. Worship was now in Danish, not Latin. The Bible was translated. Monasteries were closed, though many monks and nuns were allowed to live out their lives in peace. And, crucially, education was tied to the new faith. Every parish was required to have a school, so that every child, boy, or girl could read the scriptures. This was not just piety. It was nation building. A literate populace, loyal to the king and the Danish tongue, would be harder to divide. By 1537, Denmark was a Protestant kingdom, unified, centralized, and financially stronger than it had been in a century. Norway, now a hereditary possession of the Danish crown, no longer a partner, but a province, followed suit. Sweden was gone, but Denmark no longer needed it. The era of three crowns had ended. But from its ashes rose a new Denmark, smaller in territory, but stronger in identity. A kingdom where faith, language, and law were no longer borrowed from Rome or shared with rivals, but forged at home in the cold northern light, by kings who had learned that true power lies not in conquest, but in control of the soul. The year is 1540. You stand in the nave of Roskilde Cathedral, the burial place of Danish kings since the 12th century. Sunlight slants through high Gothic windows, catching motes of dust that swirl like forgotten prayers. The air smells of beeswax, incense, and cold stone. But something is different now. The Latin chants are gone. In their place, a hymn rises in Danish, clear, solemn, and deeply familiar. The words are from the new church ordinance, written under King Christian III, and they speak not of distant saints or papal authority, but of grace, forgiveness, and a God who speaks directly to the soul. This is the sound of a new Denmark, not just a Protestant nation, but a unified monarchy, where king, church, and people share one tongue, one faith, and one destiny. The Reformation had done more than change religion. It had centralized power by confiscating the vast lands of bishops and monasteries. The crown had become the largest landowner in the realm. Royal coffers swelled. The nobility, though still powerful, now answered to a king who claimed divine right not through the Pope, but through Scripture itself. And this king was not alone. He was advised by bureaucrats, not barons, trained in Lutheran theology and Renaissance humanism. A new class of civil servants, Kanzlerråder, chancellery counselors, began managing tax rolls, legal codes, and foreign correspondence. Denmark was becoming a modern state, not by revolution, but by quiet, paper-thin reforms signed in candlelit chambers. But beyond the cathedral walls, the old rhythms continued. Farmers rose before dawn to feed their cattle. Fishermen mended nets in the harbor. In towns like Aalborg, Odense, and Ribe, guilds regulated who could bake bread, forge iron, or weave cloth. Life was still hard, still local, but now, every church pulpit echoed the same message. Obey your king, for he rules by God's will. This was the birth of absolutism, though it would not be formalized for another 120 years. For now, Denmark was a hereditary monarchy, but one still constrained by the Council of the Realm, a body of nobles who elected the king and approved taxes. That balance would not last. In 1588, Frederick II died, leaving the throne to his one-year-old son, Christian IV. A regency council ruled in his name, but when Christian came of age in 1596, he did not return power to the nobles. He kept it, and over the next 60 years, the longest reign in Danish history, he would use it to build, fight, dream, and, ultimately, lose an empire. Christian IV was a paradox. A king who walked the streets of Copenhagen in plain clothes, chatting with merchants, yet who spent fortunes on palaces, warships, and wine. He spoke 8 languages, fathered 24 children, only 12 acknowledged, and believed Denmark was destined to be a great power. He began by transforming Copenhagen, where once stood wooden houses and muddy lanes. He erected Rosenborg Castle, a Dutch-style Renaissance palace with ornate gables and a crown-topped spire. He founded Nyboder, a planned neighborhood of yellow row houses for Navy officers. He built Kastellet, a star-shaped fortress that still guards the harbor, and he dreamed of colonies. In 1620, he sent ships to the Coromandel coast of India, establishing a trading post at Tranquebar. In 1625, he claimed the island of St. Thomas in the Caribbean. though it wouldn't be settled until 1672. He even sent expeditions to Greenland, hoping to re-establish contact with the lost Norse settlements. Denmark, he believed, could rival the Dutch and English, but his ambition outpaced his resources. When the 30 Years' War erupted in 1618, a catastrophic religious and political conflict that would consume Central Europe, Christians saw a chance to expand Danish influence in northern Germany, where the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, ruled in personal union with Denmark, bordered the Holy Roman Empire. In 1625, he invaded. At first, success. But then came Albrecht von Wallenstein, the brilliant imperial general, and Tilly, the Catholic League commander. At the Battle of Lutter in 1626, the Danish army was shattered. Christian fled the field. His allies abandoned him. By 1629, he was forced to sign the Treaty of Lübeck, surrendering all his German gains but, crucially, retaining Schleswig and Holstein. Denmark had survived, but its dream of Baltic hegemony was over. Worse was to come. While Denmark bled, Sweden rose. Under Gustavus Adolphus, Sweden transformed into a military superpower, with disciplined troops, modern artillery, and a ruthless navy. By the 1642, it controlled much of the southern Baltic coast. The old order had flipped. Denmark was now the weaker Scandinavian power. And in 1643, Sweden struck. In a lightning campaign over the frozen Little Belt Strait, Swedish troops invaded Jutland. The Danish fleet was caught off guard. Towns burned. The countryside was looted. The Second Northern War had begun. Copenhagen itself was besieged in 1658. For months, citizens hauled cannons onto rooftops. Women melted down jewelry for bullets. Children carried water to defenders. But the city held thanks in part to a Dutch fleet that broke the Swedish blockade, honoring an alliance with Denmark. Still, the peace was brutal. The Treaty of Roskilde, 1658, forced Denmark to cede Scania, Halland, Blekinge, and Bornholm, the entire eastern third of the Old Kingdom. These were not frontier lands. They were heartlands, fertile, populous, and deeply Danish in language and culture. Overnight, 1/3 of the kingdom's population became Swedish subjects. And though Bornholm rebelled and returned to Denmark the next year, the others were lost forever. The psychological wound was profound. For centuries, the Sound, Øresund, had been Denmark's inner sea. Now, Sweden controlled both shores. Denmark was no longer a Baltic power. It was a North Sea nation, smaller, humbler, and haunted by loss. Yet from this defeat came rebirth. In 1660, a crisis of succession forced the nobility to make a choice: restore the old elective monarchy, or accept hereditary absolutism. They chose the latter. King Frederick III, Christian IV's son, seized the moment. With popular support from clergy and burghers, he dissolved the Council of the Realm, declared himself king by the grace of God, and issued a new constitution, the King's Law, Kongeloven, of 1665. It was the most absolute monarchy in Europe. Article 2 read, "The king is the highest authority on earth, standing above all human laws, subject to no one but God alone. No parlement, no veto, no checks." Power flowed from the crown alone. And for the next 130 years, Denmark would be ruled by kings who saw themselves not as feudal lords, but as enlightened fathers of the nation. Frederick III's son, Christian VR, 1670–1699, codified Danish law in the Danish Code of 1683, which standardized justice across the kingdom and curtailed noble privileges. He also introduced nobility titles, Count, Baron, to bind the elite closer to the crown. But the true architect of the Danish Enlightenment was Frederick IV, 1699. 1730, and his successors. They turned inward not to war, but to reform. In the countryside, a quiet revolution unfolded. For centuries, most Danish peasants had been tenant farmers, bound to noble estates, paying rent and labor and grain. But after the losses of the 17th century, the crown needed productive, loyal subjects, not serfs. In 1702, Frederick IV began allowing peasants to buy their freedom. In 1733, his successor Christian VI introduced the Stamsbond, a law that restricted peasant movement to ensure army recruits, but which also ended hereditary serfdom. Then, in the 1782, under Christian VII, though ruled in practice by his minister Andreas Peter Bernstorff, Denmark enacted sweeping agrarian reforms. Peasants could now own land, inherit property, and choose their marriages. By 1800, over 60% of farmland was in peasant hands, the highest rate in Europe. This was not charity. It was statecraft. A free farmer was more productive. A literate farmer could read the Bible and royal decrees. A loyal farmer would defend the realm, and literacy flourished, thanks to the Lutheran emphasis on reading scripture. Denmark achieved near universal literacy by 1800, decades before most of Europe. Schools dotted every parish. Catechism classes doubled as civic instruction. The king was not just a ruler. He was a pastor king, guiding souls and soil alike. Culturally, Denmark shone. Tycho Brahe, the astronomer who lost his nose in a duel and wore a brass prosthesis, built Uraniborg on the island of Ven in the 1582, a palace of science where he mapped the stars with unprecedented precision, laying groundwork for Kepler and Newton. In the 18th century, playwright Ludvig Holberg wrote satirical comedies that mocked greed, hypocrisy, and blind tradition, becoming the father of Danish literature. And in 1742, the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts was founded, training painters, sculptors, and architects who gave Copenhagen its elegant neoclassical face. But the world outside was changing faster. The American Revolution, 1776, and French Revolution, 1789, sent shockwaves through Europe. Denmark, officially neutral, tried to profit shipping grain, timber, and naval stores to all sides. But neutrality is a fragile shield. In 1801, the British Navy, fearing Denmark would join the League of Armed Neutrality, an alliance with Russia and Sweden against British sea power, sailed into the Øresund. Under Admiral Horatio Nelson, they demanded Denmark surrender its fleet. When Copenhagen refused, the British bombarded the city. For hours, cannon fire shook the capital. Houses burned. Civilians huddled in cellars. The Danish Navy fought bravely but was outgunned. The Battle of Copenhagen, 1801, ended in a truce, but the message was clear. Denmark's sovereignty was conditional. Worse came in 1807. With Napoleon dominating Europe, Britain feared the Danish fleet would fall into French hands. Ignoring Danish neutrality, a British armada besieged Copenhagen again. This time, they demanded complete surrender of the navy. When Denmark refused, the British unleashed a 3-day bombardment, the first use of firebombs on a European capital. Over 2,000 civilians died. A third of the city burned, and when the smoke cleared, Denmark had no choice. It handed over its entire fleet, 18 ships of the line, 15 frigates, and 30 smaller vessels. Humiliated, King Christian VII's government turned to France. Denmark joined the continental system, Napoleon's blockade against British trade. But the cost was ruinous. British warships blockaded Danish ports. Grain exports collapsed. The economy spiraled. And in 1813, Denmark declared state bankruptcy. The final blow came in 1814. After Napoleon's defeat, the victors redrew Europe at the Congress of Vienna. Denmark, as a French ally, was punished. By the Treaty of Kiel, it was forced to cede Norway to Sweden, a union that had lasted 434 years. In return, Denmark received Lauenburg, a small duchy in Germany. It was a bitter trade, a kingdom for a county, but there was one consolation. Denmark retained Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and Greenland, Norway's Atlantic possessions, because they were considered dependencies of the Danish crown, not part of Norway proper. So, as the age of absolutism ended, Denmark stood smaller, poorer, but more unified. The dream of empire was dead, but from its ashes grew a new ideal: the welfare of the people. A nation no longer defined by conquest, but by education, agriculture, and quiet resilience. The king still ruled absolutely, but now his duty was not glory, but care. And in the decades to come, that care would blossom into the Danish welfare state, the most radical innovation of all. But that story belongs to another age. For now, in the candlelit halls of Amalienborg Palace, a king signs a treaty with a trembling hand. Outside, the wind carries the salt of the sea and the faint, mournful cry of gulls over a land that has lost much, but forgotten nothing. The year is 1815. Copenhagen is quiet, not with peace, but with exhaustion. The harbor, once bustling with merchant ships bound for India, the Caribbean, and the Baltic, now lies half empty. The Royal Navy, surrendered to the British in 1807, has not been rebuilt. The treasury is empty. The countryside, though fertile, bears the weight of debt, loss, and a gnawing national shame. Denmark has survived, but at what cost? The Treaty of Kiel has just stripped it of Norway, a union older than memory. The dream of a Scandinavian empire is gone. The dream of neutrality has proven a fantasy. And the dream of greatness, buried beneath the rubble of bombed neighborhoods and the salt-stung silence of a diminished coastline. Yet, from this humiliation, something unexpected begins to grow. Not armies, not colonies, but stories. In the decades after 1814, Denmark turns inward, not in despair, but in discovery. As the old aristocracy fades and the monarchy retreats from grand ambition, a new force rises from villages, schoolhouses, and printing presses: national identity. And it begins with a man named N.F.S. Grundtvig, a pastor, poet, historian, and visionary. Grundtvig believed that Denmark's true strength lay not in its navy or its nobles, but in its folk, its language, its songs, its shared myths. Denmark is not a state, he famously declared. It is a people. This was revolutionary. For centuries, loyalty had been to king, church, or local lord. But Grundtvig argued that Danes were bound by something deeper, a common cultural soul, expressed in the rhythms of the Danish tongue, the cadence of folk ballads, and the wisdom of old sagas. He championed the translation of the Eddas and Saxo Grammaticus, reviving tales of shield maidens, sea kings, and gods who walked among mortals. He called for education that nurtured spirit, not just skill, leading to the founding of the first folk high school in 1844 at Reading, where young farmers came not to learn Latin, but to read poetry, debate ethics, and sing hymns under vaulted wooden ceilings. This was romantic nationalism, not as a call to arms, but as a call to belonging, and it spread like rye across a field. In towns and rural parishes, people began collecting folk songs, weaving traditional costumes, and celebrating street John's Eve with bonfires, and dancing, a custom nearly lost to Enlightenment rationalism. The Danish language, once overshadowed by German in elite circles, especially in the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, became a badge of pride. Newspapers like Fædrelandet, the Fatherland, preached national unity. Poets like Adam Oehlenschläger wrote odes to Norse gods reborn as symbols of Danish resilience. But this cultural flowering had a shadow, because Denmark was not one land, it was three. To the north, Denmark proper, Jutland, Zealand, Funen, ethnically Danish, Lutheran, and increasingly nationalistic. To the south, The Duchy of Schleswig, a patchwork of Danish-speaking villages in the north and German-speaking towns in the south, ruled in personal union with the Danish crown since the Middle Ages. And just below it, the Duchy of Holstein, entirely German-speaking, part of the German Confederation, but also tied to the Danish king through inheritance. This tangle of loyalties had been manageable under absolutism, but in the age of nationalism, it was a powder keg. German intellectuals, inspired by their own unification movement, began claiming all of Schleswig as historically German. "Up to the Eider!" became their rallying cry, the Eider River being the traditional southern border of Denmark. Danish nationalists countered, "Down to the Danevirke," the ancient earthwork that ran across Schleswig, symbol of Danish defense since the Viking Age. The king, Christian VIII, tried to hold the line. In 1846, he issued a declaration affirming that Schleswig was indivisible from Denmark, a move that enraged German nationalists but thrilled Danish patriots. When he died in 1848, his son, Frederick VII, inherited a crisis, for in February 1848, revolution swept Europe. In Paris, the king was overthrown. In Vienna, Metternich fled. In Berlin, citizens demanded constitutions. And in Schleswig-Holstein, German-speaking elites declared independence from Denmark and union with Germany. They formed a provisional government, raised a flag black, white, and red, and appealed to the German Confederation for support. Denmark faced a choice: surrender its southern lands or fight. On the 23rd of March 1848, Copenhagen erupted. Tens of thousands gathered in City Hall Square, waving Danish flags, singing hymns, and demanding that the king defend the realm. Volunteers, farmers, students, craftsmen flooded recruitment offices. A young composer named Carl Helsted wrote a new song that would become an unofficial anthem. "With hearts of fire and hands of might, we'll guard our land, our freedom's light." The First Schleswig War, also called the 3 Years' War, had begun. At first, Denmark stood alone. The great powers, Britain, France, Russia, sympathized, but refused to intervene. The German Confederation sent troops under the banner of liberation. Danish forces, though outnumbered, held the Danevirke line through the winter of 1848-49. But in 1849, fortune turned. A Prussian general, Friedrich von Wrangel, laid siege to Fredericia, a key fortress town in eastern Jutland. The Danes, under General Gerhard Christoph von Kroh, prepared for the worst. Then, on the night of July 5-6, they launched a surprise counterattack. Through rain-slicked fields and muddy trenches, 14,000 Danish troops charged under cover of darkness. Cannon roared, bayonets flashed. The Prussians, caught off guard, retreated in disarray. The Battle of Fredericia became legend the moment Denmark proved it could still defend itself. July 6 is still celebrated in Fredericia today. By 1850, international pressure forced a ceasefire. The London Protocol of 1852, signed by Britain, France, Russia, Austria, Prussia, and Sweden, declared that the Danish king would remain Duke of Schleswig and Holstein, but the duchies would not be fully integrated into Denmark. It was a fragile peace, and it rested on one man, Frederick VII, who had no heir. The Danish royal line of Christian III was about to end. A succession crisis loomed. Denmark chose Prince Christian of Glucksburg, a distant cousin with Danish roots through his mother, as heir. He was acceptable to Danish nationalists, though less so to German elites in the south. In 1863, Frederick VII died. Christian became Christian IX, and within weeks, he was handed a political time bomb. The November Constitution, drafted by Danish nationalists, it proposed a unified Danish state, including all of Schleswig, but excluding Holstein. To German nationalists, this was treason. The new constitution violated the London Protocol. It ignored the rights of German speakers, and it threatened to tear the duchies apart. In Berlin, a young Prussian minister named Otto von Bismarck saw his chance. Not through speeches and majority decisions, he would soon declare, but by iron and blood. He convinced Austria to join Prussia in defending German interests in Schleswig-Holstein. In January 1864, Prussian and Austrian troops crossed the Ida River. The Second Schleswig War had begun. This time, Denmark had no illusions. It appealed to Britain and France, but both refused to act. Napoleon III feared war. Britain feared German disruption of trade. Denmark was alone. The Danes abandoned the Danevirke too long to defend with their small army and fell back to the Dibble Peninsula, a fortified position near the Baltic coast. For 3 months, they held out. Under constant bombardment, soldiers huddled in trenches, eating hard bread, writing letters home, listening to the thunder of 200,000 artillery shells, fired by Prussian guns, the most intense bombardment in Europe since Napoleon. On the 18th of April, 1864, the Prussians attacked. At dawn, through fog and smoke, 37,000 Prussian troops stormed the ramparts. The Danes fought bravely, bayonets against rifles, courage against numbers. But by midday, Dibble fell. Over 3,000 Danes were killed, wounded, or captured. The defeat was catastrophic, not just militarily, but psychologically. In October 1864, the Treaty of Vienna forced Denmark to cede Schleswig, Holstein, and Lauenburg. Overnight, 200,000 Danes became subjects of Prussia and Austria. The loss was deeper than land. It was a wound to the soul. But strangely, it did not break Denmark. It reforged it. In the years after 1864, Denmark entered a period of intense national introspection. The slogan, "What was lost outwardly must be gained inwardly," became a national mantra. Farmers formed cooperatives, dairy collectives, where smallholders pooled milk to produce butter and cheese for export. By 1880, Danish butter was prized in London and Paris, sold in branded tins with the Danish crown. Education expanded. Every village built a school. The folk high school movement grew, teaching not just reading, but civic pride. The military, humiliated but not disbanded, reformed under officers who emphasized citizen soldiers, not mercenaries. And politically, the monarchy accepted constitutional limits. In 1849, Denmark had already adopted a constitution, ending absolutism and creating a parliament, Rigsdagen, but it was the trauma of 1864 that cemented liberal democracy as Denmark's path forward, not through conquest, but through consensus. Yet the loss of Schleswig haunted the nation. In the northern part of the duchy, 40,000 ethnic Danes now lived under German rule. Their schools were Germanized, their language suppressed, their churches monitored. They became known as the Danish-minded, a quiet resistance of farmers, teachers, and pastors who kept Danish songs alive in barns, taught children to read in secret, and voted for Danish candidates in local elections. Denmark never forgot them. And in 1920, after World War I, the world finally listened. The Treaty of Versailles mandated a plebiscite in Schleswig. In Zone 1 Northern Schleswig, 75% voted to return to Denmark. In Zone 2 Central Schleswig, 80% voted to remain with Germany. On the 10th of July 1920, King Christian X rode across the new border on his white horse, greeted by weeping crowds waving Danish flags. The reunification was peaceful, joyful, and deeply emotional. But in 1871, as Bismarck proclaimed the German Empire in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, Denmark watched from the sidelines, not with envy, but with a hard-won wisdom. It had learned that small nations survive not by force, but by unity, not by shouting, but by building. Houses, schools, cooperatives, constitutions, and above all, a story that said, "We are Danish, not because of borders, but because of who we are. This was the legacy of 1864, not defeat, but rebirth. The year is 1875. You wake to the sound not of church bells, but of hooves on cobblestone, and the distant clatter of a horse-drawn milk cart rolling through the village square. The air smells of fresh bread, manure, and the sharp tang of lime-washed walls drying in the morning sun. This is not the Denmark of kings and conquests. This is the Denmark of cooperatives. In the decades after the traumatic loss of Schleswig in 1864, a quiet revolution began not in parliaments or battlefields, but in farmyards, village halls, and women's sewing circles. It was a revolution built not on anger, but on pragmatism, trust, and collective action. And it started with butter. Before 1880, Danish farmers sold raw milk to local dairies often owned by German-speaking landlords or merchants in the cities. The milk was processed into butter of inconsistent quality, sold under anonymous labels, and fetched low prices in foreign markets. But then, a young agricultural advisor named H.C. Peterson had an idea. What if small farmers pooled their milk? What if they built a shared dairy, equipped with modern separators, standardized methods, and a common brand? In 1882, the first cooperative dairy opened in Hedding, a village in western Jutland. It was a modest wooden building with a brick chimney and a small steam engine. But inside, everything was new. Centrifugal separators imported from Sweden, hygienic vats, and quality controls enforced by elected committees of farmers themselves. The butter they produced was creamy, golden, and uniform. They stamped each tin with a crown symbol and the name of the cooperative. Soon, Lur brand butter, named after the ancient Bronze Age horns, was selling in London, where housewives prized its purity and taste. By 1900, over 1,000 cooperative dairies dotted the Danish countryside. By 1914, Denmark was the world's largest exporter of butter, a remarkable feat for a nation with no colonies, no vast plains, and a population under 3 million. But the cooperatives did more than boost exports. They democratized wealth. Profits were returned to members based on how much milk they contributed, not on how much land they owned. A smallholder with 5 cows earned alongside a larger farmer. Women, who often managed dairy work, gained economic influence. Children stayed on farms because there was a future, not just subsistence. This was capitalism with conscience. And it spread. Pig farmers formed slaughterhouse cooperatives. Egg producers built packing stations. Grain growers established shared mills. The cooperative movement became Denmark's economic backbone, a network of trust that turned scattered homesteads into a unified export machine. But it was not just economics. It was identity. At the heart of this transformation was a belief. We rise together, or not at all. This spirit extended into politics. In 1871, the Social Democratic Party was founded not as a radical revolutionary group, but as a pragmatic labor party seeking better wages, education, and social protections through parliamentary means. Its leaders, men like Peter Christian Knudsen, spoke not of overthrowing the state, but of reforming it from within. They found common ground with the Liberal Party, Venstre, which represented farmers and rural interests. Together, they pushed for universal suffrage, public education, and workers' rights. In 1898, Denmark passed its first Workmen's Compensation Act, one of the earliest in Europe providing payments for workplace injuries. In 1901, the principle of parliamentarism was formally adopted. The king would appoint a government that had the support of the majority in parliament. Absolute monarchy was gone. Now, power flowed from the ballot box, from farmers, laborers, and shopkeepers who voted not just for leaders, but for a shared vision of society. And that vision included women. For centuries, women had been excluded from public life, but the cooperative movement gave them a role as dairy managers, bookkeepers, and organizers. The folk high schools taught them civic responsibility. In 1887, the Danish Women's Society launched a campaign for suffrage. They held lectures, published pamphlets, collected signatures. Critics scoffed. "Women belong in the home," they said. But the women replied, "The home is part of the state." In 1908, women gained the right to vote in local elections. In 1915, the new democratic constitution granted full suffrage to all women over 25, making Denmark one of the first countries in the world to do so. That same year, Bodil Begtrup, a school teacher and activist, became one of the first women elected to the Riksdag. She would later say, "We did not ask for permission. We claimed our place." This was the spirit of modern Denmark: participatory, practical, and deeply humane. Yet the world beyond was not kind. In 1914, Europe plunged into war. Denmark declared neutrality, not out of indifference, but from bitter memory. The losses of 1,864 had taught the nation that small countries survive by avoiding great power conflicts. For 4 years, Denmark walked a tightrope. It traded with both sides, sending butter to Britain, grain to Germany. It mined North Sea oil in small quantities and expanded its merchant fleet. And it avoided invasion partly through diplomacy, partly through luck. When the war ended in 1918, Denmark emerged prosperous and intact, and it finally addressed the wound of 1,864. As agreed in the Treaty of Versailles, a plebiscite was held in Schleswig in 1920. In Zone 1 Northern Schleswig, 75% voted to return to Denmark. On the 10th of July 1920, King Christian X rode across the new border on his white horse, greeted by weeping crowds waving Danish flags. It was a moment of quiet triumph. No guns, no bloodshed, just democracy in action. But peace did not bring ease. The 1,920 seconds brought economic volatility. The 1,930 seconds brought the Great Depression. Unemployment soared, farms defaulted, families went hungry. Yet Denmark did not collapse into extremism, as Germany and Italy did. Why? Because it had already built safety nets. In 1933, Denmark passed the Kanzlergade Agreement, a landmark compromise between Social Democrats and liberals that laid the foundation for the modern welfare state. It included unemployment insurance pension reforms, public works programs, farm debt relief. Crucially, it was funded by progressive taxation and accepted by all major parties. This was not socialism in the revolutionary sense. It was social solidarity, a pact that said, "Your well-being is my responsibility, and mine is yours." And it worked. By 1938, Denmark had largely recovered from the Depression, while much of Europe still suffered. But a darker shadow loomed to the south. In 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Denmark watched uneasy, but hopeful that neutrality would protect it. In 1939, it signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany. But on the 9th of April 1940, at 4:15 a.m., German warships entered Copenhagen harbor. Paratroopers landed at the airport. Tanks rolled into town squares. Denmark had 2 hours to decide: resist and face annihilation or surrender. The government chose surrender. In just 6 hours, the country was occupied. Unlike Norway, which fought for weeks, Denmark offered minimal resistance. Some called it cowardice, but others saw it as strategy. The Danish government remained in place. The king stayed in his palace. The police kept order. For the first 3 years, life in Denmark continued with eerie normalcy. Shops stayed open. Newspapers published, though censored. Children went to school. Danish soldiers even trained in uniform, though they were forbidden from guarding strategic sites. This was the peaceful occupation, a fragile illusion maintained by both sides. Germany needed Danish agricultural exports to feed its troops. Denmark needed to preserve its institutions. But beneath the surface, tension grew. In 1941, the Danish government reluctantly allowed the creation of a Danish Nazi party and banned the Communist Party under German pressure. But ordinary Danes began to resist quietly at first. They listened to BBC broadcasts on hidden radios. They published underground newspapers like Landog Folk. They wore red, white, and blue pins, the Danish colors, as subtle defiance. And then, in 1943, everything changed. Germany demanded that Denmark institute the death penalty for sabotage. Ban strikes hand over Danish Jews for deportation. The Danish government refused. On the 29th of August 1943, the Germans declared martial law, dissolved the government, and seized control. The Danish Navy scuttled its ships in Copenhagen harbor to keep them from German hands, and the resistance movement went public. Sabotage cells blew up railway lines. Students painted anti-Nazi slogans on walls. But the most urgent mission was saving the Jews. Denmark had around 7,800 Jews, most living in Copenhagen. When word spread that the Gestapo planned to round them up on the night of October 1943, Danes acted with astonishing unity. A German diplomat, Georg Ferdinand Duckwitz, leaked the plan. Rabbis warned congregations. Neighbors hid families in basements and summer cottages. Fishermen ferried people across the Öresund to neutral Sweden in fishing boats, often at night, through minefields, for little or no pay. In just 3 weeks, over 7,200 Jews and 700 non-Jewish relatives escaped to safety. Only 472 were captured and sent to Theresienstadt. And even then, the Danish government pressured Germany to keep them alive, sending food parcels and demanding inspections. 99% of Denmark's Jewish population survived the Holocaust, the highest rate in Nazi-occupied Europe. This was not luck. It was national solidarity, the same spirit that built cooperatives and welfare laws now turned to rescue. After the war, historians would debate, was this the goodness of the Danish people, or a result of specific historical conditions? The truth is both. Denmark had no tradition of anti-Semitism. Jews had been full citizens since 1814. They were neighbors, doctors, shopkeepers, not others, and Denmark's small size, flat terrain, and proximity to Sweden made escape possible. But above all, it was a moral choice made by thousands of ordinary people who said, "Not here, not on our watch." When the war ended on the 5th of May 1945, Danes poured into the streets not with vengeance, but with relief and song. King Christian X, who had become a symbol of quiet resistance by riding daily through Copenhagen unguarded, waved from his balcony. The nation had been occupied, but not broken. It had lost 3,000 citizens, a tragedy, but far fewer than its neighbors. And it emerged with its democracy intact, its institutions preserved, and its moral compass intact. In the war's aftermath, Denmark doubled down on its welfare model. Universal healthcare, free university, paid parental leave. Not as luxuries, but as rights. Because if the war had taught one lesson, it was this: society is only as strong as its weakest member. And in the quiet villages where butter tins still bore the crown, in the cities where children played near resistance memorials, Denmark began to build not just peace, but dignity for all. The year is 1948. Snow falls softly over Copenhagen, dusting the spires of Frederiks Church and the red-tiled roofs of Nyhavn. The war has been over for 3 years, but its shadow lingers in ration books, still in use, in the hollow eyes of returning prisoners. In the quiet way people speak of neighbors who never came back, yet something new is stirring. In the basement of a modest townhouse in Esterbro, a group of economists, union leaders, and politicians meet over weak coffee and stale rye bread. They are not drafting a constitution. They are not planning a revolution. They are building a social contract. This is the birth of what the world will later call the Scandinavian model, a delicate balance of free markets, strong unions, universal welfare, and high trust. And Denmark, smaller and more pragmatic than its neighbors, would become one of its quietest but most consistent architects. The trauma of war had taught a hard lesson. Security is not just military, it is social. If a nation wants peace, it must first ensure that no citizen is left behind. In 1947, Denmark joined the Marshall Plan, accepting $287 million, equivalent to over $3 billion today, in American aid. But unlike some European nations that use the funds for grand infrastructure or industrial revival alone, Denmark invested heavily in people. New schools were built, hospitals expanded. Housing projects rose on the outskirts of cities, offering clean, sunlit apartments to families who had spent years in overcrowded tenements. And at the heart of it all was a simple idea. Every Dane, from fisherman to professor, deserves dignity. This wasn't charity, it was strategy. By the 1950 seconds, Denmark had fully embraced the welfare state as its national identity. Universal health care meant no one feared a doctor's bill. Free higher education meant a farmhand's daughter could become an engineer. Generous parental leave meant fathers and mothers could hold their newborns without choosing between love and income. Unemployment insurance replaced shame with support, recognizing that job loss was often bad luck, not moral failure. And it was all funded by progressive taxation, not as a burden, but as a civic duty. Danes didn't resent paying high taxes. They saw it as buying peace of mind for themselves and their neighbors. This trust became Denmark's greatest resource. While other nations polarized over class, Denmark built tripartite cooperation. Government, employers, and unions negotiated wages, working conditions, and economic policy together. Strikes were rare, lockouts rarer, because everyone knew we rise or fall as one. This spirit extended into culture. In 1952, designer Arne Jacobsen unveiled the Series 7 chair, a stackable, affordable, elegant piece of molded plywood that would become a global icon. It embodied the Danish ideal, beauty for everyone, not just the elite. At the same time, Lego, a small toy company from the town of Billund, began exporting plastic bricks worldwide. Their motto, "Only the best is good enough." It wasn't just about toys. It was a national ethos, precision, quality, and honesty in every endeavor. Denmark also became a leader in design democracy. From Poul Henningsen's pH lamps, which cast soft, glare-free light using mathematical curves, to K. Bogeson's wooden monkeys, hanging playfully in children's rooms, Danish design fused function, simplicity, and warmth. It wasn't cold minimalism. It was human-centered living, and this extended to cities. Copenhagen began prioritizing bicycles over cars as early as the 1962. While other capitals widened highways, Denmark built bike lanes, closed streets to traffic, and turned parking lots into playgrounds. Why? Because a child should be able to ride to school safely. Because clean air is a right, not a luxury. Because a city belongs to its people, not its vehicles. By 1970, over 50% of Copenhageners commuted by bike. But Denmark's path wasn't without tension. The Cold War divided the world and tested Denmark's neutrality. In 1949, despite deep reservations, Denmark joined NATO. It was a painful choice. The memory of 1,940 German tanks rolling in while the world watched was still fresh. Neutrality had failed. But joining NATO meant aligning with the West, hosting American bases, and accepting nuclear deterrence. Many Danes protested. Intellectuals warned of losing sovereignty. Farmers feared foreign influence. Yet, the government held firm. Better to be protected than alone. Crucially, Denmark negotiated a caveat: no nuclear weapons on Danish soil during peacetime. It was a small act of defiance, but it preserved Danish identity within the alliance. At home, politics remained remarkably stable. The Social Democrats and Liberal Party alternated power, but both supported the welfare state. Ideological extremism whether communist or fascist, never gained traction. Why? Because the system worked. A factory worker in Aalborg could afford a summer cottage. A teacher in Odense could send her son to university. A widow in Ribe could live with dignity on her pension. There was no need for revolution because reform was constant, quiet, and inclusive. Then came 1972, a year of two crowns. In January, King Frederick IX died. His daughter, Margrethe, became Queen Margrethe II, Denmark's first female monarch in 500 years. Her accession was not just symbolic. It reflected a nation that had long believed in gender equality. Women had voted since 1915. They'd served in cabinet since the 1952nd. Now, they would see their highest office held by one of their own. And in October 1972, Denmark faced an even bigger choice. A national referendum asked, should Denmark join the European Economic Community, EEC? The debate was fierce. Farmers feared losing subsidies. Fishermen worried about EU quotas. Intellectuals feared cultural dilution. But others saw opportunity: access to a common market, peace through integration, a seat at Europe's table. The result? 63% voted yes. On the 1st of January 1973, Denmark became a member of the EEC alongside Britain and Ireland. It was a turning point. Denmark was no longer just a North Sea nation. It was European, yet it retained its quirks. In 1985, it banned nuclear power, choosing instead to invest in wind energy. The first commercial wind turbines rose on the island of Bornholm. Skeptics called them Dutch follies. But by 1990, Denmark was the world's leading producer of wind turbines, with companies like Vestas exporting green technology globally. This wasn't just environmentalism. It was economic foresight. Denmark turned a moral stance into an industry. The 1980 seconds also brought new challenges. Globalization strained traditional industries. Shipbuilding declined. Textile mills closed. But Denmark adapted, shifting to high-value services, design, pharmaceuticals, and renewable tech. Education became the new oil. Every child learned English from age 6. Universities partnered with businesses. Lifelong learning was encouraged. And in 1989, Denmark made history again. It became the first country in the world to legalize registered partnerships for same-sex couples. The law wasn't full marriage, but it granted nearly all the same rights. It passed with broad support, not as a radical act, but as a logical extension of equality. As one lawmaker said, "Love is love. Why should the state deny it?" This quiet progressivism became a hallmark of modern Denmark. By the 1990 seconds, Denmark was often ranked the happiest country on earth. Critics called it smug. Supporters called it proof that security, trust, and fairness create contentment. And the numbers backed it up. Low income inequality, high social mobility, strong public institutions, deep interpersonal trust. Over 70% of Danes say most people can be trusted, double the global average. Even the monarchy evolved. Queen Margrethe II, a trained archaeologist and artist, modernized the royal family, letting her sons marry commoners, allowing photos of her grandchildren in jeans, and even illustrating books under a pseudonym. She became not a relic, but a bridge between tradition and modernity, duty and humanity. And in 1993, her son, Crown Prince Frederik, married Mary Donaldson, an Australian commoner, a union that symbolized Denmark's openness to the world. But not all was idyllic. Immigration became a growing issue. After 1970, Denmark accepted guest workers from Turkey, Pakistan, and the Middle East to fill labor shortages. Many stayed, bringing families, building mosques, opening shops. By 2000, 5% of Denmark's population was foreign-born, a small number by European standards, but enough to spark debate. Some welcomed diversity. Others feared loss of identity. The Danish People's Party, founded in 1995, gained traction by calling for stricter immigration controls, framing it not as racism, but as preserving the welfare state. If we open the doors too wide, they argued, the system will collapse. It was a tension Denmark would grapple with for decades. Yet, through it all, the core remained. A society built on mutual care. By the year 2000, Denmark stood as a paradox to the world. Small in size, yet outsized in influence. Neutral in spirit, yet deeply engaged. Traditional in values, yet radically progressive in practice. It had no empire, no oil, no superpower hellies. But it had something rarer. A shared belief that life should be fair, safe, and meaningful for all. And on winter evenings, as candles glow in every window and parents read to children in cozy apartments, that belief feels less like policy and more like home. The year is 2005. This is modern Denmark. Calm, clean, and seemingly unshakable. But beneath the surface, a storm is brewing. On the 30th of September, 2005, the newspaper Jyllands-Posten publishes 12 editorial cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad. Some show him with a bomb in his turban. Others portray him as a stern figure, a warrior, or a symbol of extremism. The editors claim it's an exercise in free speech, a response to self-censorship among Danish artists. The reaction is immediate and global. Within weeks, Danish embassies are firebombed in Damascus and Beirut. Boycotts of Danish goods, especially Arla butter and Lego, spread across the Middle East. Death threats flood newsrooms. Diplomats are recalled. And Denmark finds itself at the center of a clash between two ideals: the Western commitment to free expression and the global Muslim community's reverence for religious sanctity. For Danes, the crisis is disorienting. Free speech is not just a legal right in Denmark, it's a cultural cornerstone, as natural as cycling or consensus. The idea that drawing a picture could ignite international fury feels surreal. Yet the government refuses to apologize, citing neutrality and the independence of the press. The cartoon crisis becomes a turning point. It forces Denmark to confront its place in a globalized world, no longer a quiet Nordic backwater, but a nation whose actions ripple across continents. It also accelerates a national debate about integration, identity, and the limits of tolerance. In the years that follow, immigration policy hardens. In 2002, the Danish People's Party, a right-wing populist group, had already pushed through one of Europe's strictest immigration laws. Family reunification delayed, language tests required, welfare access limited for newcomers. After the cartoon crisis, these policies gain broader public support. The message is clear. To belong in Denmark, you must embrace Danish values, including gender equality, secularism, and, above all, the right to criticize even the sacred. This stance wins praise from some free speech advocates and condemnation from others who see it as cultural insensitivity disguised as principle. Yet Denmark remains deeply committed to its welfare model. Even as immigration policies tighten, the state continues to invest in universal healthcare, free university, and subsidized childcare. A single mother in Aarhus can afford preschool. A factory worker in Odense can retrain as a nurse at state expense. An elderly man in Rennes receives daily home care without draining his savings. This is the Scandinavian paradox. Open-hearted solidarity at home, guarded skepticism toward outsiders, and it works economically, at least. By 2010, Denmark has weathered the global financial crisis better than most. Its banks are stabilized. Unemployment stays below 8%. Public trust in institutions remains high. Over 80% believe the government acts in their interest. Part of this resilience comes from a quiet revolution in green technology. Back in the 1970s, Denmark banned nuclear power. Instead, it bet on wind. By 2020, over 50% of Denmark's electricity comes from wind turbines on land and offshore. The country is a global leader in wind tech, with Vestas and Ørsted exporting turbines and expertise from Texas to Taiwan. Copenhagen aims to be the world's first carbon-neutral capital by 2025. Bike lanes expand. District heating systems, using waste heat from power plants to warm homes, cover 98% of the city. Rooftop gardens bloom. Electric buses hum through streets once ruled by combustion engines. This isn't just policy, it's pride. Danish children are taught in school that Hygge, the art of cozy contentment, is not just about candles and wool socks, but about living lightly on the earth. Yet, challenges persist. Housing in Copenhagen becomes scarce and expensive. Young couples move to Malmö, Sweden, just across the Øresund Bridge, for affordable rents thanks to the Øresund region, a bi-national urban zone linked by train and shared labor markets. The aging population strains pensions. By 2025, 1 in 4 Danes will be over 65. Reforms raise the retirement age to 67 and encourage older workers to stay employed. And the monarchy, long a symbol of unity, faces new questions. In 2024, Queen Margrethe II does the unthinkable. She abdicates. After 52 years on the throne, the longest reign since Christian IV, she steps down in favor of her son, Frederick X. In a televised address, she says she wants to pass the crown to a new generation with fresh energy. The decision shocks the nation. Abdication is rare in Danish history, but the transition is seamless. Frederick, a former naval officer and environmental advocate, is widely respected. His Australian-born wife, Queen Mary, has won hearts with her fluency in Danish, her charity work, and her elegant yet approachable style. Together, they represent a modern monarchy, less ceremonial, more engaged, deeply aware that tradition must evolve to survive. Meanwhile, Denmark's role in global security shifts. Once a cautious NATO member, Denmark becomes more assertive after Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea, and even more so after its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Denmark sends military aid, opens its ports to NATO ships, and dramatically increases defense spending, breaking its long-standing cap of 1.5% of GDP to reach 2%, meeting NATO targets for the first time in decades. In 2022, Danes vote in a referendum to end their EU defense opt-out, allowing full participation in European security initiatives. It's a quiet but profound shift from neutrality to engagement. This is driven in part by events in the Arctic. Denmark, through its sovereignty over Greenland, controls a vast strategic territory, rich in rare earth minerals, oil, and shipping lanes. As ice melts, the Arctic becomes a new frontier of great power competition. The US reopens Thule Air Base in northern Greenland. China seeks mining rights. Russia flexes its naval presence. Denmark responds not with bluster, but with diplomacy and deterrence, increasing its Arctic patrol fleet, funding scientific research, and reaffirming that Greenland is not for sale, as Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen bluntly tells US President Donald Trump in 2019. Back on the mainland, society grapples with digital transformation. Denmark is one of the world's most digitally advanced societies. Citizens file taxes in under 5 minutes online. Medical records are accessible via a secure app. Public services operate through Digital Post, a centralized platform. But this efficiency comes with tension. Older generations struggle with mandatory e-government. Rural communities worry about losing human contact in services, and debates flare over data privacy, surveillance, and the ethics of AI in public administration. Still, trust holds, because in Denmark, technology serves people, not profit. Perhaps the most enduring trait of modern Denmark is its social trust. Over 75% of Danes say they trust their neighbors. 90% believe most people are fair in everyday dealings. This isn't naive optimism, it's the result of a century of shared institutions, transparent governance, and mutual obligation. This trust is why the Happiness Index consistently ranks Denmark among the world's happiest nations, not because life is easy, but because no one is left to face hardship alone. Yet the world grows louder, angrier, more polarized. Social media amplifies extremism. Climate anxiety weighs on youth. Global conflicts feel closer than ever. In response, Denmark doesn't retreat, it reinvents. Designers create modular housing for climate refugees. Architects build flood-resilient neighborhoods in vulnerable coastal towns. Schools teach media literacy alongside math and Danish. And every evening, across the country, people light candles, brew tea, and gather with loved ones. Because Hygge isn't escapism, it's resistance. A quiet insistence that slowness, connection, and care still matter in a world obsessed with speed, noise, and spectacle. As we reach 2025, Denmark stands at another threshold. It is no longer an empire, no longer a neutral bystander, no longer purely agrarian or industrial. It is a knowledge society, a green pioneer, a digital democracy, and a welfare state under pressure but not broken. It faces the same storms as the rest of the world: rising seas, political fragmentation, generational change. But it does so with a quiet confidence born not of superiority, but of shared experience. From the bog sacrifices of the Iron Age to the cooperatives of the 19th century, from the rescue of the Jews in 1943 to the wind turbines spinning over the North Sea, Danes have learned one lesson above all: we are stronger together. And so, as the sun sets over the Øresund, casting golden light on Lego towers, windmills, and bicycle racks, Denmark continues its experiment. Not in conquest, but in community. Not in shouting, but in listening. Not in being the biggest, but in being whole.